Live now, so hello YouTube. I'm here with Professor Graham Priest once more, returning back to the podcast. It's been, I think, I don't know, 5, 6 years since I recorded a podcast with you a long time ago. So it's very nice to have you back on, Graham. How are you doing?
Thanks, Alex. It's a pleasure to be back. I'm away from home at the moment. I'm in Germany at a couple of conferences. The weather's been pretty good till today, and now it's pissing down. But it's a
It
pleasure to be
looks like
back.
it looks like you've got one of those standard sort of backdrops behind you, but actually is the background behind you because you're sat in a hotel lobby.
Yes, it is. It's real. And so am I.
Okay, good. Um, all right, excellent. So last time you were on, we had a kind of generic, like, what is dialetheism? We went through some of the examples of like paradoxes of motion and that type of thing. So this week, this time round, what I'm going to do is focus the conversation on some related, slightly different area. So I was thinking we could look at the connection between like contradictions and rationality is basically the sort of glue that's going to
Okay.
connect all of these questions together. Um, some of them I was hoping we can sort of settle some of these questions because they seem to me some of these things are like myths that at least in the slums of internet philosophy of religion debating they're still thrown around with authority even though
Mm.
professional philosophy has left them behind a long time ago. So I was hoping with some of them we can just clear some ground away, and then with some of the other ones, it would just be really nice to get your unique perspective on how to answer some of these challenges.
Okay.
So
Well, wherever you want to go, I'm happy to go. Myths are hard to kill.
yeah, we can have a good stab though, see what happens. All right, so firstly, let's talk a little bit about this. So recently, viewers on this channel will know that I've been engaging with some content of an author who claims that who throws around what I consider to be a myth these days anyway, which is that um, there are three laws of logic: the law of
Mm.
non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle, and the law of identity. And that basically is logic. And if you know what
Mm.
those laws are, then you finished your logic training.
Mm.
So just very quickly, if you could say something about like the history of that idea and how, like broadly speaking, why that's not the right way to look at it these days.
Yeah. Well, look, a bit of history. Um, The law of non-contradiction and the law of excluded middle are first found in Aristotle in the Metaphysics. Notice that they're in the metaphysics, not the logic. Okay, they're in the metaphysics, not the analytics. By the Latin Middle Ages, they are taken to be principles of logic. That's true. When the medievals realized there's more to logic than syllogistic. The law of identity is ambiguous because it's usually said that A is A, but what kind of thing is A and what kind of thing is? And so it can be understood as for every claim or sentence A if and only if A. But it can also be understood as every object is self-identical. Okay, and those are clearly different principles. One's to do with propositional logic, one's to do with quantified logic. But anyway, sophisticated discussions of identity don't really get sort of cemented in logic until Leibniz. So the first sort of clean statements you get are in Leibniz and post-Leibnizian philosophy. There's a bit about identity in Aristotle and a bit about identity in some of the medievals, such as Abelard, but they really come to the fore only after Leibniz. Okay, so first of all, those principles, let me step back. There was a revolution in logic at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, when mathematics was applied to logic for the first time. Mathematics are by then developed to a point where the mathematical tools were ripe. Leibniz didn't have the right mathematical tools, although he tried very hard. But what happened in logic made virtually everything that came before, if not obsolete, then let's just say antiquated. So now the sort of standardy of logic, which is the logic that you'll get if you learn Logic 100 in a philosophy department, was sort of invented by the German philosopher Gottlob Frege, and then picked up by Bertrand Russell, and then a bunch of German mathematicians like Hilbert and so on. So that's called classical logic, which is itself a misnomer because it's got nothing classical about it. I mean, classical logic, if it's anything, is Aristotelian syllogistic, and modern logic is incompatible with that. They're inconsistent with each other. Okay, so if you look at the principles I've just enunciated, they are taken to be correct in classical logic, and that's right. But there's an awful lot more because they hold in many logics where other bits of classical logic fail. So at the very least, there's more to logic than that. And it's worse than that because we now know that there are many systems of logic. There are big arguments about which ones are right, of course, but in some of them, those three principles don't hold at all. So not only is there more to logic than that by any understanding, but a number of logicians will deny some of those principles nowadays. So people who say there are three laws of logic, that's the end of the story, are a bit out of date.
Yeah, right. And I also think maybe just the idea that there are laws of logic in that simple way as well. It seems like it's, to me, I think of, it seems like what's more important is the properties of the system in general. And I mean, you can say, oh, okay, this is our axiom, or these are our axioms or something, and this is the system that follows. You could probably generate the same system with a different set of axioms. And
Oh, that's certainly true. And in fact, those three principles could be taken as axiomatic in classical logic, but mostly they're not. The only one that will normally appear as an axiom is the law of identity in the second form I gave, which is for all x, x equals x. The other things are usually deduced from, the other so-called laws are usually deduced from more fundamental things, or different things anyway.
right, right. Or we just sort of give a semantic rather than an axiomatic setup, and then we're not even giving different axioms. We're just sort of giving
Yeah,
the meanings of our terms or something, and then theorems just pop
correct.
out.
And if you approach it model theoretically or semantically, there's nothing that's taken as basic. All logical truths are on a par, as it were. It's only when you sort of approach it axiomatically that you've got to take some things as basic. But one thing we know is that any axiomatic theory can be axiomatized in numerous different ways. Logic's the same as any other axiomatic theory in that regard. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, good, good. Enough on the three laws of logic. Although we could spend a lot more time talking about that, but we've got some other juicy topics to get our teeth stuck into. So, how about we move on to this? So the you live in a pure rarefied environment of academia, so you won't know about the sort of slum-like fighting matches that goes on the internet between people talking about philosophy as much as I do. But there's a kind of weird form of um, uh, I guess it's mainly Christian, but of apologetics anyway, which is called presuppositional apologetics. It's a
Hmm.
maddening argument form. I sort of hope you don't know what that's about because I feel like it would be demeaning to
Well, I'm,
waste
I'm
time
happy to
telling
tell you I don't.
you. Good, good, good. Um, but what's going on there is that often there's transcendental arguments are basically being
Hmm.
invoked, and often they sort of hand wave towards, well, this is just like how Aristotle argues for the law of non-contradiction
Hmm.
in the metaphysics, right? So I want to sort of key this up as a question for you. Like,
Hmm.
isn't it the case, right, that if only you can get your opponent to say something,
Hmm.
then you've trapped them in a commitment. They're now committed to the truth of this proposition and not its falsity or something, and
Yeah.
that means that they are presupposing the law of non-contradiction, and then we've proved it transcendentally that it's sort of
Yeah.
required if only anybody says anything. So isn't that just one quick way? If that was right, then dialetheism, all this stuff about contradictions would be off the table because you'd be presupposing the law of non-contradiction even by arguing for
Yeah.
dialetheism.
It's not just a view you find on the internet. I mean, you will find this in the literature as well. Whether you want to call this a transcendental argument, I don't know. I mean, that terminology comes from Kant, and we're talking about Aristotle. And Aristotle is playing a somewhat different game. But if you want to call, doesn't all discussion or argument presuppose the law of non-contradiction? If you want to call that transcendental, it's not quite what Kant means, but it'll do. Who cares what it's called?
Yeah.
So, first of all, I don't know how many of the people who say this have read Aristotle. They should. Okay. So he's in the Metaphysics book Gamma. He states the principle of non-contradiction. Actually, he sort of gives a couple of different statements of it, which are not obviously equivalent, but he states it. And then he says, you can't prove it, but I'm going to give you an argument for it. Okay, so clearly he doesn't take his argument to be a proof, at least in the sense that he intends, right? Okay, what you then get are one long argument and 6 or 7 throwaway arguments. The first of them does presuppose getting your interlocutor to say something, the others do not. So these claims apply at best to the one long argument. Let's come to that in a second. The 6 throwaway arguments, very brief, a paragraph, or sometimes a line or two. And the most obvious things about them is that they change the subject. So the statement of the law of non-contradiction is clear. No contradictions can be true. But what the small arguments appear to have as a conclusion is that it's not the case that all contradictions are true, which is completely different, of course. So why Aristotle sort of changes the subject there is something that scholars argue about, but they don't support the law of contradiction. And that's pretty much the consensus of scholars. All right. Now, the one long argument is tangled, to say the least. Does it work? Look, modern commentators can't even agree how it's supposed to work, let alone that it works. There are some people who will interpret some bits of it in the way you've just said. I think most modern commentators do not interpret it like that. But the bits of it that can be interpreted like that do say, let's start by getting your interlocutor to say something, and then something absurd is supposed to follow from that. So since the absurd can't happen, the law is a presupposition of discourse or whatever. All right. Now, when you sort of work through the text and try and figure out what it is that's absurd, what appears to be the case is that Aristotle takes the person who says this to be destroying his theory of metaphysics, which is essentially that there are substances, substance being matter with a form. Okay. Now, virtually nobody subscribes to that view anymore. Metaphysicians nowadays gave up Aristotle a long time ago. Sort of essentialism has come back. to quite a large extent, but not in Aristotle, not in Aristotelian form. So at the very least, it's only a proposition if you subscribe to Aristotelian metaphysics. And it must be said that the argument that the view is incompatible with Aristotelian metaphysics is exceptionally tangled and bad. Even a modern Aristotelian is going to be able to point out flaws in it. So, as I say, there's a lot going on in that argument. It doesn't hang together well. It's a bit of a mess. People interpret it different ways. But even if you interpret it in the way that the people who suggest this interpretation you've suggested, it doesn't really work when you look at the details. And you've got to look at the details. I mean, why is it a presupposition? That's the crucial question. Okay, you say speech, well, making claims presupposes the principle of non-contradiction. That's a very hard claim to make good.
So it's more than just committing to the truth of one. I mean, because it seems obviously the case, right? So it's almost too soft a target that simply by saying, okay, I'm going to commit to P, the truth of P, and also I'm going to commit to the falsity of not P or something. So I'm like taking a stand on one side of a contradiction and not the other kind of thing. Cool, you can do that, but that doesn't mean that there's no other statement which is a contradiction. It might be some dusty old semantic paradox like the liar sentence or something might nevertheless be both true and false kind of thing, just
Correct.
because I'm committing to something.
So, if you want to put it like that, taking a stand on one thing is independent of taking a stand on other things, right? So taking a stand on the existence of God is absolutely irrelevant to taking a stand on the capital of Australia.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, there's an issue about how you define falsity, but let me slide over that for a moment. If you believe in violation of the law of non-contradiction, truth and falsity are in general independent of each other, because some things are true and false, some things are true and not false, some things are false and not true. So truth and falsity don't work together, as it were. And the same is actually true if you think that there are things which are neither true nor false. So once you think that truth and false are independent of each other, then taking a stand on one is irrelevant to taking a stand on the other, just as much as taking a stand on the existence of God is independent and irrelevant to the capital of Australia.
And it seems like, well, that's one way that people have read Aristotle, and I think that if they were interpreting somebody else, they would be more inclined to think this is just a bad argument. But because they're interpreting Aristotle, they think, oh, it must be really deep, and there's probably some meaning that if only I keep doing analysis or exegesis or something, I'll be able to reconstruct what must be a really deep argument here.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, lots of people, of course, do try to defend the law of non-contradiction. Lots of people do claim to find their sort of favored strategy in Aristotle. But it must be said they do this largely by cherry picking bits of texts. And the bits of text, the arguments they construct are really not much better than Aristotle's. But the comment about Aristotle is interesting because, look, it was clearly Aristotle that established the principle of non-contradiction as high orthodoxy in Western philosophy. That doesn't mean there haven't been people who dissented. Hegel is the most obvious example, but he's not the only one. Okay. But you'd think that because his arguments set the principle of non-contradiction into high orthodoxy in Western philosophy, they better be pretty good. Look, you read the bloody things,
Mm-hmm.
and I dare anyone to come away and say, well, that settles the matter then.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, that's not just my view. That's largely the view of modern scholars on that bit of the metaphysics. there was a Polish logician, a very good Polish logician and classical scholar, Łukasz, who wrote a book in 1910 in which he just analysed the arguments and he demolished them.
Mhm.
And I think most modern classical scholars agree with Aristotle's demolition.
With Yukasevich's demolition.
Sorry, with Łukasz demolition. Thank you very much. Though the arguments are pretty terrible, in fact. And there's a question of why they were so influential. Okay, well, Aristotle per se was really influential.
Mhm.
I mean, he was known in the Latin tradition as the philosopher. Plato tended to come second best. And so much scholarship, logical scholarship, both in the Arabic tradition and the Latin tradition, let's sort of assume that Aristotle got it right and then sort of and develop his ideas and so on. So virtually everything Aristotle said got to be sort of canonized. Okay. But nowadays, virtually nothing that Aristotle said is accepted because we've seen that, he's a clever guy, but most Aristotelian views have now been rejected. Some of them have made a comeback, like virtue ethics, but very few people are going to be straight Aristotelians, except maybe in the Thomist tradition.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a question of why it hasn't happened to the law of non-contradiction before now, in fact. And I've always been inclined to think that, principle of non-contradiction may be the last bastion of Aristotelianism. And it's probably about time it went too.
Right. Which is, of course, I mean, the whole point of this, what was fallacious that we were saying a moment ago is in those later arguments is just, it's not the case that if the principle of non-contradiction rules out all contradictions, so in order to argue against it, you only need to sort of make room for one. That's enough to undermine the principle. So any
True.
argument for the principle of non-contradiction can't just rule out all contradictions being true. There's a
Correct.
kind of quantification shift or something
Correct.
going on there.
That's
In that.
absolutely right. And something else that frequently happens is that when people try to argue for the principle of non-contradiction, they either evidently or maybe not so evidently tend to presuppose it. So various other bits of Aristotle's arguments fall into this category too. And there's a well-known phrase for this kind of situation, which is called begging the question. It's
Right.
actually kind of hard to mount arguments that don't beg the question. I'm not saying it's impossible, but the most obvious things you think of tend to do that.
Well, for instance, if somebody said that they would show you that the law of non-contradiction was true by using a reductio ad absurdum argument, then that would be begging the question because it explicitly invokes the principle of non-contradiction in order to, you assume P, you derive Q and not Q, and then you use that to derive not P. But
Yeah,
that's only the case if there aren't any contradictions, right? So
yes, that's
without
right.
presupposing a whole bunch of blatantly, without presupposing the principle of non-contradiction itself, you can't really use that argument. So
That's true. I mean, there are various sort of sophistications in what you concerning what you say, but essentially what you say is quite right. Is absolutely right.
okay, good. So here's another version of that sort of worry, which I think is probably less obviously wrong, but still kind of interesting. And see what you think about this. I got this by reading a paper by Stephen Reed, which I
Mm,
think is called something like Relevance Logic, the One True Logic, or something like
hmm.
that. I'm sure you know the paper. But in that, he discusses a worry that I think logicians were dealing with around the time that relevance logic and paraconsistency kind of came onto the scene, where
Mm,
there was this question about, like, well, it's all fair enough to kind of state non-classical, like the new non-classical kind of semantics and vocabulary and blah blah blah, the elements of your paraconsistent logic. But when we do that informally across the seminar room or whatnot, I'm saying the rules in English or German or
Mm.
whatever. And when I'm doing that, aren't I, at least is the challenge, aren't I using, not in the normal sense of not when I introduce, say, some kind of dialectic not that behaves slightly
Mm.
differently, you might think, isn't this just kind of a language game set in a backdrop, against which it's classical, right? I think that was kind of
Mm.
the worry that you can construct these things, but you can only do so in a classical setting. So
Yeah,
hopefully that set out the worry enough.
yeah. Well, they argue in ordinary language like German or Chinese, but the semantics of vernacular expressions, it's a difficult question. I mean, one way you can think of a logic is as providing a semantics for certain logical constructions. But the question is, what's the right account? Now, classical logic gives one account. It's very different from the account that was given in previous generations by medieval logicians. It's not at all clear that Aristotle or the Stoics have this account. Certainly in the 20th century, a number of logicians have disagreed that classical logic gives the right account, like intuitionist logicians, relevance logicians, and so on. There are substantial issues here. You can't just assume that what happens to be the logic that's currently in vogue, as it were, gets it right, because usually what's in vogue turns out to be wrong. You know, people who say these things, I think, often have done Logic 100, and they assume that what they were taught there is getting it right. But you don't have to know much about the history of logic to know that, whether negation satisfies the classical principles is a contentious matter.
That's right. And it's kind of true for all of I mean, and is probably relatively straightforward. I mean, classical and there's not much to argue about with that, but it's certainly implication in classical logic, like
Yes,
material conditional, like nobody really thinks that that's
yes.
capturing natural language very well.
No, that's true. I mean, the worst offender is the conditional. And the conditional has been highly contentious for 2,500 years. And arguably, we still haven't got it right. That's because there are so many more options for the conditional than for negation. Concerning negation, the choices are fairly few and relatively stable. But there's disagreement about what they are, going right the way back in logic.
So, I mean, like your classical definition of negation is just going to be not P, just means the P is false, right? But
Mm.
that is so, I mean, a well, at least a dialectic understanding of it has to be a bit more sophisticated than that. So I was trying to talk about this on a video a while back, but my understanding of how you're doing it is it's something like you're just taking it's just switching the value. So in your LP logic, where there are still two truth values, but some propositions can have both of them, then the negation of a purely true statement is a purely false one. So like not P, if P is purely true, is purely false. But if P is both true and false, then not P is also just true and false as well. So the definition of not is changed slightly because the context is different. There are other
Yeah,
possibilities for the combinations of truth values and
yeah.
things. So it's all wrapped up together, the definition of negation and the semantics.
Oh, yes. Yes. I mean, if you look at things like negation, falsity, untruth, you can define any one of those in terms of the others. But there's no way you can't you go around in a circle very fast. So there's no way in which you can take one of those as fundamental and hope that that's going to settle matters. But it's worth observing that the word false is sort of ambiguous, because it can mean either having a true negation or it can mean not being true. So, I mean, it's either not true or true not. There's a switch between the truth and the negation, right? So these are often run together, and they're run together because in classical logic they're equivalent.
Mhm.
For a negation to be true is for the thing negated not to be true. Okay, but as soon as you get into any logic in which there are truth value gaps and gluts, these two things fall apart. Because if there are truth value gluts, things can be true and false. And if you believe in truth value gaps, things can be neither true nor false. So untruth and the truth of negation fall apart. Now, one can hardly claim that the equivalence between truth of negation and negation of truth mean the same thing, because if that was right, there couldn't be truth value gaps or truth value gluts. And lots of philosophers, including Frege and Aristotle, argued that there were some things which are neither true nor false. So, these are two pretty high profile logicians. And so they didn't accept this sort of, that you can sort of switch truth and negation, because they believed in truth value gaps. Now, truth value gluts are a bit more contentious, but you can see it's going to be contentious that truth of negation and negation of truth come to the same thing.
And someone simply just saying, "Well, damn it, that's my definition," or something, and just sort of clinging desperately to some classical notion. That doesn't really settle anything because it's
No,
kind of just
no.
question.
So, I mean, let me prove to you that God exists. Well, by God, I mean my left foot. My left foot exists, therefore God exists. Obviously, it's a parody, right? You cannot settle substantial philosophical issues simply by definition.
Yeah, right. Good. Okay, excellent. So, um, as I thought, what might happen, we're not getting very far through these questions, I don't.
You'll have to have me back again sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about like belief and consistency then. So,
Mm.
as you mentioned before, Aristotle states the law of non-contradiction in several different ways. One of them, you could say, which calls a psychological version of the
Yeah.
principle, which maybe we should call the doxastic version or something to
Okay.
be more precise. But like the idea there is supposed to be something like you can't, like nobody can believe. I mean, I think he says something like you can't believe that which is not, or something, kind of Aristotelian
Correct.
way.
And he actually gives an argument for it, which begs the question. But he does say that.
Okay, but like, is it possible, like just in general, stepping away from exactly what Aristotle says, what if somebody just, you're having a coffee shop chat with them, they ask you what you do, you start explaining it, and they say, "Oh, that can't be right. It's impossible to believe that P and that not P, right?
Mhm.
How could I, that surely that's impossible."
Yeah, just
What would you
false.
say?
That's false. I'll give you a counterexample. Me. I believe that the Lysander is true and false. You know exactly what I mean. Okay, people don't always believe what they say they believe. This is true. They might not know what they're talking about. They might be confused about the meanings of words. Take it from me, I'm not. Um, Look, sometimes I still hear people say, "You can't believe a contradiction." I don't, I don't hear that very often nowadays. Because there are too many bloody obvious counterexamples. And there are people in the history of, it's not just modern diletheists, there are people in the history of philosophy who do so. One is Hegel, one is Meister Eckhart, one is Plotinus. No, that they all explicitly enunciate contradictions and endorse them. These are not stupid people. They're not confused with words. So I don't hear that point made very often nowadays. So I don't know where this thought is coming from, but I suspect it's from people who have never really studied these things, and maybe they've just done Logic 100 and suppose that they've been given the truth. But interestingly enough, there's this subject called X-Phi.
I don't think I do.
Okay, it's called
Oh,
experimental philosophy.
Yes, am familiar with that broadly. Yeah.
Okay, and what philosophers who work in this tradition do is go around and ask people what their views are
Mhm.
about, trolley problems, moral problems, or God, or contradictions. Okay, and there are several studies on whether the person in the street can believe contradictions, and they show that most people are quite happy to endorse contradictions in some contexts. So the one that's been studied most widely are Sorites paradoxes. So this is where borderline cases. So no, it's been pissing down, hasn't quite stopped yet, but it's sort of almost stopped, but it hasn't quite, is it both raining and not raining? Is it neither raining and not raining? And it turns out that a lot of people will say, yeah, it's both raining and not raining and neither raining and not raining. So, the person who hasn't done Philosophy 100 will be quite happy to accept some contradictions. And you might want to say, well, yeah, but trained logicians will never do that. Well, that gets them into the other horn of the dilemma. They've got to face people like me.
Mhm. That's right. I think there's another class of counterexamples, which is people like me, which is fucking idiots who just can't keep their beliefs straight. So I'm constantly I'm always finding
Good.
irrational inconsistencies between the way that I look at the world, and but I do, that is my mental state. So it just sort of follows from that it's possible for someone to
No,
believe a contradiction.
you're right. Failure to think, to be aware of your beliefs. And we're all a bit like that sometimes. So, I mean, I've often found that my beliefs are inconsistent inadvertently. You know, our mental states, our beliefs are kind of chunked, and often peak and occur in one chunk and not peak and occur in another, and you never actually put them together. So sometimes in the past, I found myself that I believe I'm going to be in, I don't know, Melbourne tomorrow, because I've made an appointment to be there. And then I believe I'm going to be in Sydney tomorrow because I've made an appointment to be there too. And I can even assert those things within 5 minutes of each other. And they occur in different sort of boxes of my beliefs. And then suddenly I think, oh, bloody hell. I've just failed to integrate my beliefs properly. And I think, everyone's in that situation.
Yeah, that's right. Anyone who's honest about it, it seems to me, that I think people may put on a front and try and pretend that that couldn't possibly happen to them because they've sorted it all out or something. But anyone reasonably intellectually honest, I think, has to admit that their web of beliefs is probably somewhat jumbled. It just seems.
Yeah, you've only got to teach Philosophy 100 and listen to your students and try and help them out in their confusion.
Yeah, and in general, like if someone even like yourself is gonna think that if you find and discover a contradiction like that you're going to be in Melbourne tomorrow and that you're going to be in Sydney tomorrow, the thing to do about that isn't to just casually say, "Well, I guess that's another I've found another contradiction in the world" or something.
Mm.
You're going to say, just like a classical logician, for most of the time you discover a contradiction, the first thing to think is, let's see if we can get rid of that. I'm
Sure,
going to try and make my beliefs consistent where possible, right?
maybe. Yeah, yeah. I mean, uh, yeah. I mean, the view that some contradictions are true doesn't mean you've got to consider the possibility that any contradiction is true. So sometimes, if I believe I'm going to be in Melbourne and not in Melbourne because I'll be in Sydney, then I'm confused, right? And something's gone wrong. But suppose we're talking about infinity or self-reference or strange phenomena that happen in boundaries or whatever, then matters are not so obvious.
Yeah. So is there would you describe is there a class of beliefs or something where you would say these ones I'm pretty sure they're all consistent. So when I find a seeming contradiction, my first thought would be to get rid of it. Whereas, I mean, you just listed some kind of categories there, but is there
Mm.
some positive category you can say which characterizes it consistent?
Yeah, look, I don't think you can say that a priori. I think it's once you've said that some contradictions are true, if you're looking for a safe zone, a priori. I don't think you're going to find one. So Hume said that the wise person apportions their belief to the evidence. In the end, what you believe is what you can find evidence for. Now, can you find evidence for anyone being in Sydney and Melbourne at the same time? I'd like to know that, because it would be kind of good to be able to do that. It would get you out of a jam sometimes.
Yeah.
But, if you're talking about the liar paradox or whatever, it's obviously quite different.
Right. Good. Okay. So, all right. Yeah. Here's another one of these. Just curiosity. Do you know who Jordan Peterson is? Have you ever heard of him?
Yes, I have heard of him. I think I even listened to one of his podcasts once.
Did you? Interesting. It would be great to pick your brains about that. Let's just not talk any more about him, but just to simply say, because that's for people who are watching, they might be more familiar with it. Unfortunately, might be more familiar with his views than either of ours. But he has said before something along the lines of, you can't really claim to believe something unless it manifests itself in your actions and what you do.
Mm.
So there's a connection, he thinks, between believing. So you can't just privately believe in God or something. If you're going to be a theist or Christian or something, that must manifest itself in some way, whatever. Anyway, so the thought would be, riffing on that kind of idea, believing in a contradiction can't generate any actions, you might think, because you might say
Yep.
something like, look, if I think that this can of Coke is full of Coke and not full of Coke, then I'm sort of paralyzed to know what to do, like Buridan's ass or something.
Mm.
How do I go for a drink or do I not go for a drink? I'm sort of stuck between those two. So there's no way it can kind
Mm.
of manifest itself in any action. And if Peterson's idea is right, then that would mean that I couldn't believe it either, because
Yeah.
I believe it
Okay,
must
good.
come out.
So look, the connection between belief and action is a bit sort of it's a bit sort of so let's say it's not at all clear many times, especially once you get sort of recondite things such as subatomic particles, infinity, and so on. But even in sort of common or garden cases, believing a contradiction can clearly have consequences for the way you act. Let me give you an example. Let's suppose I believe that Jesus is a man and not a man. Okay, it could be the Jesus, as we're talking of Peterson, but it could be any person. It might be Jesus who lives in Costa Rica. I don't know. All right. Suppose I believe that Jesus is a man and not a man. Well, what I do is dependent not only on my beliefs, my desires. Standard. Suppose I want to see a man, and there aren't many around, and I know that Jesus is somewhere around. I'll look for Jesus, right? Suppose I want to see a not man, and there aren't many non-men around, then I'll look for Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Suppose I desire to see a man and not a man, then I'll look for Jesus. And when I've found him, I will be satisfied that I have satisfied both desires. So, my believing and that Jesus is a man and not a man can stop me ending my search after I've seen Jesus.
Right. As simple as that. Okay, and
As simple as that.
I could also believe that I might, if I believe that the legal system is incoherent and has places things to be both legal and illegal, the same action, I might petition my MP to change the law and sort that out. And that would only be the case if I believed that this thing was both legal and illegal, or legal and not legal at the same time.
Yeah, good point.
Right. Good. So it just seems like um, another reason to think that Jordan Peterson is wrong about something, like obviously wrong about
Well,
something.
look, I think Wittgenstein says in the Investigations that when we do philosophy, we're often misled by an inadequate diet of examples.
Hmm.
And he was dead right about that. So when someone says, can you get on a bus and miss it at the same time? No. Can you stand on your head and not stand on your head at the same time? Well, no. And these sort of very sort of obvious examples come to your head, and you think, oh yeah, well, that proves it, doesn't it? Well, a bunch of examples does not a universal generalization prove. And sometimes, the counterexamples, the things that are false, can be kind of recondite. The history of mathematics and philosophy and science is just full of these things.
Good, good, good. Okay, so it's a parochialism perhaps at work there.
Yeah, yeah, it's failure to think deeply enough to be satisfied with the superficial.
All right, so let's talk a bit about. I suppose there's something. I think this is fiddly and complicated, but there's something about. I suppose my challenge isn't going to come across as very plausible, but it's an opportunity for you to say a little bit about the topics involved. But you might say something like, if I accept that P, then I thereby reject that not P. And that's how acceptance and rejection works. Like dialectically speaking, if I, like a lawyer interrogating somebody on the stand or something, get them to accept some notion, that so and so was out of the country at the time of the murder or something, they're thereby rejecting that they were in the country at the time of the murder. So it's kind of simple logic of acceptance and rejection that plays that dialectical role. But then, doesn't it mean with a contradiction? If I accept it, and I also doesn't it follow from that I also reject it? And don't you want there to be a sort of simple picture where you just accept some contradictions without rejecting them and sort of severing that connection?
Yeah. Yeah. This is an argument that you hear. I hear it less frequently now than I used to. To see why it's not a very good argument, start by thinking about accepting and rejecting. There's sort of mental states, but they tend to be correlated with speech acts of a certain kind. Accepting it goes with assertion, rejecting goes with denial. So you can make the point about accepting and rejecting, but I think it's easier to make it with the speech acts, assertion and denial. Okay, you've just asserted that you were in Beijing, so haven't you denied that you weren't there? Okay, so it's the same point. Right. Now, speech acts are of many kinds. There's a whole area of philosophy of language called speech act theory, of course. Standard speech acts are asserting, questioning, commanding, and rejecting. All right. Now, there's a kind of Fregean view that to reject P is to assert not P. Okay. And Frege didn't really argue for that, but he sort of said it. If that's right, denial is not a sui generis speech act because it reduces to assertion. But in fact, there are many cases where asserting or uttering a negation and denial come apart. So suppose you say to me, do you think the lie sentence is true, Graham? I say, yeah. You say, well, do you think the lie sentence is not true? And I say, yeah. Okay, I've asserted both those things, and clearly I'm not denying that because I'm telling you more about my beliefs, not taking anything away. You can deny without using negation. Someone says, do you think that Trump is the greatest president that there ever been in the United States? And I say, get real. I mean, I'm denying it, right? And I haven't used the word negation. So the connection between denial and negation is that they don't denial and asserting a negation or uttering a negation are not the same thing. Okay, so that doesn't mean they can't be connected, because the utterance of one and the same sentence can perform many speech acts, as Austin, demonstrated. So suppose I say the window's open. So I utter the window's open. What speech act am I performing? Depends on the context. I might be making an assertion. Hey, the window's open. I might be asking a question. Window's open? I might be giving a command. The window's open. All right. So one and the same sentence can be used to make many speech acts. And in the same way, uttering a sentence with a negation in could be a denial. It could be just an assertion of something independent of the thing. So once you've got your head around the thought that you've got to take the speech act of denial seriously, and that it's not neatly correlated in the way that Frege suggested with the uttering or asserting of a negated sentence, then the point collapses.
Okay, so basically, there's some you can tell. Like it's a bit like drawing out the difference between uh, negation and falsity, as we were talking about before. Sort of denial and falsity. It's kind of the same,
Yeah,
more or less, isn't it?
that's true. I mean, lots of sort of negativey things. There are lots of negativey things, and if you have a very, basic, simple theory, these can get run together. And once you have a bit more sophisticated theory, then you can see that that sort of running together is a bit simplistic.
Yeah, right. And actually, this is one of the things that I found quite um, interesting reading about how I think it's in Indian logic, um, where they have that square of like it's true, false, both, and neither. Actually, it says some logics where there's a fifth one, which is like none of those, none of those options either, or something. Where like what happened in like the Aristotelian tradition, effectively, is that he was just like, yeah, you can have like the top two, like true and false, but we're just going to forget about the other two in this sort of box that we might have otherwise with all four options or five options, depending on how you look at it. And it was just like a closing off of the imagination that just happened for 2,000 years before people started peering back. Isn't there another two possibilities down here that we could start playing around with? And once you bring those into the machinery, you have all these other options available where you can go, well, how does negation work with this? How does like a denial or rejection work now? And you want like more space conceptually to
Mm.
sort of re-engineer how everything might work together. Um,
Mm.
that sound right to you?
Yeah, that's right. And you got to remember that the first person to endorse the view that some things are neither true nor false was Aristotle himself. So it's not
That's
that
true.
modern a move.
Yeah.
But you're right about a certain aspect of Indian philosophy. I mean, certainly until about the 5th century of the Common Era, it was common to endorse something called the Chaturshkoti. And the Chaturshkoti, it means literally four corners, 4 points. And the 4 points are that if you ask me whether something's the case, I can say yes, no, both, or neither. Those are the four possibilities, right?
Mhm.
And you're also right that by the time you get to probably the most profound Buddhist philosopher after the Buddha himself, if he was a philosopher, a guy called Nagarjuna, we don't know much about him, it's 1st or 2nd century, then arguably he said, okay, none of those, the fifth possibility. So you do find things in Indian philosophy that you can interpret in exactly the way you said.
Okay, cool. Right, let's press on because like with all of this stuff, we could keep talking about it. How about so we've talked about how you can have like belief, you can believe um, contradictions perhaps and less problematic than it might first seem, the idea of believing a contradiction. What about rational belief
Mm,
and consistency? Because isn't
mm,
there now it starts to be um, a common idea that a litmus test for a
Mm.
view, whether or not it's rational, is whether or not it's, well, and let's say the kind of minimum condition or something is it is at the very least a consistent view.
Yeah,
And if you can show that somebody's view is inconsistent, then you've shown thereby that it's
yeah.
irrational. So here's one version of that question: is you might say something like, if something can be shown to be true, then it's a kind of rule of thumb. A rational person will believe something that can be shown to be true, right? It would be weird if you could show that something was true, like with a proof or something, and
Mm.
somebody still says, "Well, I don't believe it." That person's not being rational. So,
Mm.
when presented with a demonstration, that the rational person should sort of nod along to it. But
Mm.
also, if you can show that something's false, then the rational person shouldn't thereby believe that it's true. It seems
Mm.
to be like the kind of converse of that first claim. But if you have both of those together, then you're in trouble because the dialetheist, someone who wants to say that there is a contradiction, both should believe it, but also not believe it, which is different to
Mm.
what we were saying a moment ago. You should kind of accept it, but also reject it at the same
Yeah.
time. So, what would you say to that type of challenge?
Well, first of all, it's important to go back to this ambiguity of the word false. It can mean not true. It can mean having a true negation. Now, arguably, if you've got a proof of something that it's true, you should believe it. And if you've got a proof of the falsity of something, that is its negation, you should believe it. Okay. But the fact that you believe the negation does not mean that you don't believe it. Because, as we've talked about already, truth and falsity, in that sense, are independent of each other. If you have certain views about negation, right? The thought that you should not believe something if it's demonstrably not true is much more plausible. But even if that's right, that's not going to get you what you want, because you're talking about contradictions, things of the form P and not P. So is it rational? Is it rationally possible to believe P and not P? Well, okay, so we're thick in the question of what makes something rational now. And of course, people who've been philosophers east and west have been arguing about this for 2,500 years, if not longer. But for my money, I think sort of Hume got it right when he said that the rational person is someone who apportions their belief according to the evidence. So if the evidence points or establishes something or other, you should believe it. And if there's no evidence for this, then you're an idiot if you believe it. You're just gullible. Okay, Hume's view is contentious, like everything else in philosophy, but I'm happy with that. So then you ask the question is, can you have evidence for contradiction? And the answer is you can. Now, of course, it depends what you take to be evidence, and we might discuss that. But just take the lie paradox. You've got this argument, which you sort of gestured at the beginning. So it's about a sentence which says this sentence is not true. Well, if it's true, it's not true. If it's not true, it's true. So it seems to be true and not true. Okay. Well, there's an argument for you. Now, that's a bit of evidence. It's given you an argument, and the argument's prima facie good. Okay, well, here's another bit of evidence. Look, a lot of people have thought this argument, there's something wrong with it. Okay, it's been kind of the standard view for the last 2,500 years in the West. Okay, fine. Tell me what's wrong with it. People have been trying to do that for 2,500 years and failing. Well, at least if consensus is a mark of success. Because after 2,500 years after Eubulides, who, as far as we know, invented this argument, there's still no consensus. People have been coming up with ideas for 2,500 years, and they've all got obvious problems. So you've got this apparently vertical argument. You've got the fact that no one's been able to tell you, persuasively what's wrong with it, like they have with most of Zeno's arguments, for example, in 2,500 years. Well, that's not starting to look like pretty good evidence that this thing is what it appears to be, namely a veridical argument. Okay, so that's a particularly simple case because the liar argument is very simple, but it generates the point that you can have evidence for the truth of a contradiction. I've just given you one contradiction and some pretty good evidence for it.
Right. So, I think that's rolling into another question I was going to ask about actually, which was about, well, maybe a rational person is somebody who comes to believe things on the basis of good reasons.
Hmm.
And that's not much more help than saying, um, well, it's quite vague, isn't it? Basically, what's a good reason to believe something?
Hmm.
But typical good reasons might be, well, I've got an argument like deductive argument where it looks like I can't see what's wrong with it, so it feels to me like a good reason. But there are other things that philosophers have presented as good reasons to believe things.
Hmm.
Um, and presumably some of those will apply to believing in contradictions. So I
Hmm.
wonder if you could amplify that point a bit, maybe. Like, what are some of the other, like, plausibly, how, not necessarily like, give me a load of good reasons to believe in contradictions, but explain how things that people typically take to be types of good reasons could in principle apply at the very least to believing in contradictions.
Yeah. Let me just ask you a question. I think the room next door is the restaurant, and it's just opening, and they're playing music.
Mhm.
Is it interfering with you? Because if it is, I can try and find somewhere quieter.
I mean, I can sort of hear a little bit of background noise, but it's not getting in the way of you talking. It's still coming through perfectly clearly.
All
And
right.
it's a good
Okay.
point. Maybe I could ask the chat to confirm that because it really matters what they can hear. So
Yep.
there's a few seconds delay, but anyone in chat, is the music getting in the way of hearing Graham? Actually, it's a good point. I should probably say you're supposed to say this on these types of things. If you enjoy this content and this chat's been entertaining, feel free to subscribe to the channel, or if you want to ask a question to Graham, I'll have a look back through the chat in a moment. Um, if you want to put a super chat in, I'll make sure that I definitely do. I'm not seeing anybody saying that they can't hear you. I'll keep an eye on that. No, Nathan says the sound is good, so I think we just stick to where you are now because
All
it would be
right.
disruptive.
If it becomes a problem, tell me and I'll move. It'll take me a couple of minutes to wander to somewhere else.
Cool.
Okay. So,
I was asking about good reasons and how it
yes,
might be that there are good reasons
look,
for that.
let me get to that, but let me just sort of generalize the perspective. When it comes to sophisticated questions in science, logic, philosophy, ethics, the answers that are right are usually going to be embedded in theories. So if you want to know how motion works, how ethics works, how the world works in metaphysics, what the right logic is, it's no one's going to be able to say, well, P is obvious. They're going to say, well, P is in the belief that the claim that P is embedded in a web of beliefs, which we call a theory. And almost certainly in a matter of any sophistication, you're going to have different possible theories and you're going to have to choose the best. And what rationality does on a good day is choose the best theory. So look at the way that science works, for example. You want to explain black body radiation or why the moon appears to go around the earth, or we construct theories about these things and we choose the best theory. Okay, so getting slightly closer to your question, what are the canons of theory choice? And people do disagree about that, but I think generally speaking, there is consensus on what makes a theory about something rather good. First of all, it's got to be reasonably adequate to the data. That's what you want the theory for in the first place, right? But that's not the only criterion. there's a whole bunch of things, sort of secondary criteria, which we use because often the primary criterion isn't sufficient on its own. And there are things like simplicity, unifying power, comprehensiveness, not using ad hoc hypotheses too often, and you might stick consistency in the bunch. Okay, so you've got this whole bunch of criteria, and you sort of the most rational theory is the one that performs best overall. Okay, now that's pretty vague. You can make it more precise, but that'll do for the moment, right? So you've got this bunch of theories, and you choose the best. Now, could it be the case that an inconsistent theory turns out to be the best, but at least pro tem? And the answer is yes. So even if inconsistency is a kind of negative mark, it gets dominated by the other criteria. And the other criteria are important. I mean, if you ever spoke to a flat earther who's got their wits about them, you'll never catch them at a contradiction. Every time you suggest, well, we've got a piece of evidence that the earth is round, they'll say, well, it's a disk and boats go around in circles. We've been up to space, but we haven't really because it's the CIA put up. They're always come up with these ad hoc hypotheses. Their views are perfectly consistent, but you say, enough of this ad hocery. So, these other criteria are really important. Okay, so in a realistic case, could it be the case that an inconsistent theory comes out best? Well, on my view, it does come out best as far as the liar paradox goes. But are there other examples? Well, yes, there are. You look at the Newtonian dynamics as it was put forward. Okay, so we're talking about the theory of physics that was accepted for 200 years. This was based on the infinitesimal calculus, which Newton invented, or at least was one of the inventors thereof. Infinitesimals are inconsistent objects. And they all knew this. Berkeley pointed it out, and he ridiculed the scientists for criticizing religion because he said, hey, you guys are dealing with these things infinitesimals. What the hell are they? They're the ghosts of departed quantities. So they all knew that the infinitesimal calculus was inconsistent. This wasn't news. Yet they all used it as a basis for their computation of the consequence of dynamical laws. And the consequences were pretty good. They made the right predictions. So for a long time, physicists really weren't worried about the inconsistency of their theory. It was inconsistent, but hey, it made such a good job of predicting stellar motion or planetary motion. They were pretty happy with it.
Right. So it's not the be all and end all of a
No,
theory, just that it's got a contradiction necessarily. If it's super good at making predictions, you might be more happy
yeah.
to hang on to it on that basis.
And if it's the simplest theory we've got, that's another plus. So, I mean, if you look at theories of truth, then anyone who's looked at theories of truth will know they get pretty bloody tangled very fast. Whereas the dialectic theory is really simple. P is true if and only if P, end of story. Okay, you've got a contradiction, but we know how to, operate under those circumstances, and that the truth of the liar sentence doesn't imply things like I'm a frog, fine. So, I mean, even if you think that contradiction is a black mark, simplicity is another criterion that speaks in its favor. That okay, I guess I've finally answered your question. I hope I have. How it can be rational to believe a contradiction. It's part of your best theory.
Right. Good. Excellent. So that's how there could be good reasons.
Correct.
It's not incompatible with there being good
Correct.
reasons. All right.
Correct.
Okay. Great. So last couple of questions then. So one more thing was there is the favorite induction rule of philosophers throughout time is the reductio ad absurdum, right?
Yes.
And it's used in mathematics as well, of course, all over the
Some
place.
mathematics. Yes.
Right. It's a familiar rule if you do mathematics, if you do logic, if you do philosophy, or any of those sorts of things, you'll have come across the reductio ad absurdum. where and I think I outlined it very briefly. Something like from some assumption P,
Yeah,
if you can derive a contradiction, then you can infer not P or deduce that not P. Um, so, given that that's a really fun rule and everybody likes it, are you like, uh, is there any like, can you can't just straightforwardly use it all the time? You can't say this is a universal
correct.
rule of logic because it's invoking the principle of non-contradiction, and if you're operating in some system where that's not a principle, a universal principle, you can't appeal to it in all circumstances. So does that mean you can use it at all, or do you have to sort of hang up the philosopher's favorite method of proof when you move over to thinking about things in a dialectic sense?
Yeah. Look, the Reductio, in the sense you put it, is not universally correct. That doesn't mean that it's not correct in some circumstances. If you're arguing about a consistent domain, then Reductio is fine. If you're arguing about an inconsistent domain, it's not. Of course, that poses the question of when the domain you're arguing about is consistent or inconsistent, but we've talked about that, right? But it's sort of standard in the history of thought that some principles are not universally valid, but they work in a limited context. So let me give you an example. So there's this Euclidean principle that the whole is greater than any part of it, right? That was taken to be obvious by Euclid and for most philosophers for the next nearly 2,000 years. But there are contexts where that's at least doesn't seem to be right. And the most obvious was a sort of paradox that was well known, at least as early as the 6th century, that if you take all the counting numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, okay, knock out all the odd ones, what are you left with? Well, half of them, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8. Okay, so that's a part of the whole lot, right? So it must be smaller, right? No, because, they're the same size. Why? Because, well, I can pair them off one for one. 0 with 0, 2 for 1, 1 for 2, 2 for 4, 3 for 6, and so on. That's a one-to-one correlation. So they have the same size. And for a long time, people thought, that just shows that infinity is incoherent, which was a standard view through much of the history of mathematics. All right. Then you get a revolution in mathematics at the end of the 19th century, connected with a German-speaking mathematician, Cantor, who said, yeah, the even numbers are the same size as all of the numbers. So, in fact, a part can be exactly the same size as the whole. Now, that can't happen for finite domains. It can only happen in infinite domains. And in fact, what we'll do is take that as a definition of infinity. So the principle that the part must be smaller than the whole, a subset is smaller than the set itself, is valid, but only for finite domains. And so you can use that principle if you're doing finite combinatorics. You can't do it if you're using transfinite set theory. So people, of course, weren't really used to thinking about the mathematical infinite. The mathematics of the day wasn't up to it. But once you've seen that it is a valid principle, but it's only valid in a restricted domain. And once you've realized that there's more to life than is in your philosophy, Horatio, then you can apply it where it fits. So we're back to this Wittgensteinian thought that we shouldn't run away with an inadequate diet of examples.
Good. Right. So failure of imagination,
Essentially,
leading you to conclude that it must be impossible.
yeah. Although one shouldn't think that imagination is easy, because it took mathematicians and their imagination nearly 2,000 years to understand what was going on where they were thinking about the infinite.
Yeah, and there's another nice example about that, where I think it's in the Critique of Pure Reason. I think maybe in the preface or something, where Kant sort of unfortunately says something about Euclidean geometry being um, uh, what does he call it? Necessary a priori. Well, I'm getting the terms right. Is that right? He thinks it's
Yes,
can't,
he
but things
thinks it's synthetic a priori.
synthetic a priori.
Um, um, and look, he wasn't distinguishing between pure mathematics and applied mathematics, but it's that very example that has really forced us to do this. In terms of pure mathematics, if you're looking at Euclidean geometry, then that's true. But if you apply geometry to get to what it's supposed to be for or designed for, namely the spatial structure of the cosmos, it ain't true.
That's right. But also, like, maybe it was hard for I don't know, geometers or just general people to imagine what it would be like.
Good,
And it
good,
took mathematicians to sort of construct a bunch of models, and slowly we started to, our imaginations kind of caught up with the technical stuff there.
good. No, that I think that's exactly right.
Good, excellent. Okay, last one then. Um, so I hear this sometimes as well. It really annoys me. So the thought would be here, look, if you open the door to believing in one contradiction one day, so that you start thinking, well, gee, maybe the liar sentence is both true and false or something.
Mm,
Well, then the claim is, now you've committed this sort of sin in like epistemic updating, because you could do that move. If you could do that move, like, it feels like you're not allowed to do that move. It's something that when I'm confronted with new evidence that, seems to contradict my beliefs, I can update by getting rid of something I already believe, or thinking again about the new evidence, maybe
mm,
denying it, something. But what I can't do is just sort of go, yeah, that as well as my previous beliefs, even though they contradict one another. And that if you start doing that, it's kind of sin or something, according to
mm,
this view, that you could just start doing that whenever, and it becomes a kind of it's like licentious or something. It's like, well,
mm,
if it's like you hear these arguments against gay marriage or something. But, well, people will be marrying their dogs next or something. It's like,
mm,
if you ever concede that there might be a contradiction, then you know why not just do that all the time? Doesn't it become a kind of cheap, easy way of just whenever any apparent contradiction comes along, you just go, gee, I guess they're both true now or something. So
mm.
how do we make sure that we don't sort of ruin our epistemic updating
Yeah,
by doing that type of thing,
yeah,
polluting the belief state?
good. Well, I've sort of already gestured at what's going to be an answer to that.
Yeah.
In the end, it's going to be a matter of theory choice. So let me explain how this is going to work. Um, uh, let's take an example. Well, let's take an abstract example to start with. Suppose I've got a theory about something or other, and part of that is P. And then someone comes along and gives me a good argument for not P, then okay, I just like my belief by hanging on to everything I've got and adding not P. So I've got a different theory. All right, well, for a start, I haven't got a theory yet, because theory's got to be closed under logical consequence. So first of all, I've got to add P, and then I've got to close under the logical consequence of all these things. Okay, maybe when I've done that, I've got a theory. Okay, but then, of course, there are other possible theories. There are various theories you can get by deleting P,
Hmm.
and probably some of the things that entail P. I mean, if you want to be consistent, you've got to delete all the things that entail P, and there's probably going to be more than one way of doing that. Okay. Okay, so you're going to end up with a bunch of theories. Now, you then have to choose which is the best theory. And, in principle, the inconsistent theory could turn out to be right. Probably won't be, because, just adding the negation of what you believe to your belief is obviously wildly ad hoc. So it starts life with a rational strike against it, as it were. That doesn't mean it couldn't be the right thing to do, conceivably, when you think through carefully all the possibilities, all the theoretical possibilities, which could result. But simply adding the belief is, you don't even get a theory like that. You just get, a bunch of odd beliefs. If I believe that I'm a frog, and you say, well, you're not really a frog. I say, oh yeah, I'm a frog and not a frog. I mean, I had a shitty theory to start with, and this adding the belief that I'm not a frog doesn't make it any better. It makes it worse.
Right, right. Okay, good, good. So um, what you're saying is that when you're coming to consider like the effect, or like I guess you're saying you would come to consider the effect of the update on how kind of, I guess not consistent, but how like coherent in a broader sense your beliefs might be by adding it in, and how good how that
Yeah,
behaves. As we were talking about before with those theoretical virtues, is this still a good? Has it got predictive power? Is it explaining the data? Is it ad
yeah,
hoc? All of those things.
yeah. No, you've got to consider all the theories that you might get as a result of someone showing you not P when you believed P, and then choose which is the best. And simply taking some theory that you get by adding not P is actually most unlikely to turn out to be the best.
Yeah. Okay. I think as a last thought, I think what might be going on with sometimes with these types of objections is it's a bit like you know sometimes people think, well, the principle of non-contradiction has to be true, because if it wasn't true, then what's to stop there being loads of contradictions or something, right? Like as if the principle of contradiction is like the belt on my trousers that stops it from falling down. And if I
Yeah,
was to take it off, my trousers would fall down. But and it's the same sort of thing here. Like they feel like if unless I adhered, unless I kept the principle of non-contradiction as a overriding, I don't know, rational constraint or something, which police how I update my beliefs, then I'm just gonna go around willy nilly believing contradictions, and like the trousers falling down because I've just taken the thing away that's prevented it from happening. Like the principle is like a blocker that's doing something, almost like normative, I guess in this case, but metaphysically in the other case, it's like the reason there are no contradictions is because the principle of non-contradiction is true, rather than it sort of being the other way around. Reason the principle of non-contradiction is true is because there are no contradictions. That would be, I would have thought that the normal way around. It's just if there is a contradiction, then the principle isn't true. It's not there is a contradiction because the principle isn't true. Where they've sort of got the order of, I don't know, is this grounding? I'm not sure that's the right word, but they've got this kind of order of dependence or something the wrong way around, and mistake the principle for doing something metaphysically in the
yeah,
world. Does that seem right to you?
yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, I think in the last instance, this is just a very simplistic view of rationality. To
Mm.
suppose that there are sort of some grundnorms that rationality must subscribe to. I think that's really hard to justify when you look at the history of science, the history of mathematics, even the history of philosophy. Though
Mm.
that's not always a very good example. Um, so, and also people seek security, you know, something firm they can grasp onto, and it's going to be a kind of a bottom line, a kind of final stop, and it can be the principle of non-contradiction. It can be the existence of God. It can be the vaccines give you some mental illness. This it's just something firm that you can sort of build your life around
Mm.
to make you
Yeah,
feel
yeah.
secure.
Oswald wasn't the only shooter with Kennedy or
Yeah,
something.
yeah,
People with the whole worldview around these types of things. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
All
I'd
right,
never
great.
thought of the principle of non-contradiction as a conspiracy theory, but it has its attractions.
Hey, if you can think of it, someone on the internet believes it. So there will be someone out there who thinks.
Well, I mean, was it Hobbes that said that nothing is so absurd that some philosopher hasn't endorsed it?
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, actually, the I think the saying actually the contemporary one is It's not so safe for work, but it's more like something like, if you can think of it, then there's a fetish about it on the internet. So let's not go in that. We'll leave that point. I was going to quickly scan through the chat to see if there was any.
Okay.
Um, I am going to just promote a couple of. So one comment making the same point, really. If they discovered a contradiction in mathematics, my bridges would start falling down.
Mm.
Exactly the same sort of point with like Gödel, and showing that the undecidability of mathematical logic or whatever, that does that mean that now there's some set of apples, if I try counting them, then I wouldn't be able to figure out how many there were? No, that's obviously not the kind of implication that has.
Yeah. Look, I'll answer that question, but that noise is getting quite loud. Give me just 2 minutes. I'm going to move.
Okay,
Okay.
of course. Whilst you're moving, I'm going to prompt chat again. If you want to ask a question, I'm now looking at the chat, so um, now's the time. I'm just scrolling up to see if there's anything. Seems like, as typical with these things, we've had people debating each other in the chat, which is,
That's okay. Debate's good.
yeah, haven't seen anything particularly toxic yet, which is
All right.
so good.
Okay. Oh, all right. So bridges. Okay, this is a bit quiet. Okay. That is a remark that was made by Alan Turing when he was in a class of Wittgenstein in the 1930s in Cambridge. And Wittgenstein was playing with the idea that you could accept contradictions, and then Turing said, "Well, if you accept a contradiction, then when you build bridges, everything, but they fall in." And Turing was assuming the principle of explosion, okay, which is
Right.
something we haven't talked about. But explosion is the principle that contradictions imply everything, and it's an orthodox part of classical logic. It doesn't really appear in the history of logic until at least the 13th century, but it's been sort of orthodox for the last 120 years. So what Turing was assuming was that you can infer everything from a contradiction, and of course, if you can infer everything from a contradiction, then your bridges are going to fall down, because you're going to deduce all kinds of crazy things. And then, if I remember that dialogue right, Wittgenstein says, "Yeah, no, but you don't have to infer like that, because once you realize you've got a contradiction, you just stop inferring." And Turing replies to the effect that, "Yeah, but you might have a contradiction which isn't explicit; it's only implicit, and even though you don't realize it, you carry on reasoning, but this explicit contradiction is going to wreak havoc with your inference," which is quite right. Turing was right, as he often was, that if you endorse explosion, then whether you're not you're aware of the contradiction, you can get into serious trouble. Of course, if you're not using a logic with explosion, then that doesn't necessarily follow.
And Turing wasn't really around long enough to see paraconsistent logic get developed, was he? So
No. So he died mid 50s or just before that.
right, that sounds about
And
right.
modern paraconsistent logic started to appear. Well, actually, the earliest one appeared in 1948 in Poland, but they didn't start to seep into logicians' consciousness until 60s, 70s. And even then, they were hated by most logicians just because of the horror contradictionis. What? You can have a contradiction, it doesn't ruin everything? Can't have that.
Okay, we've got an actual paid for question. So
Oh, well, I hope it's worth it.
it says, do you have a preferred formalization of the law of non-contradiction? Can any expression of the law of non-contradiction rule out the... So pop that back up again.
Yeah, can you put it back up?
Yeah, I'll put it up for longer. Can any expression of the law of non-contradiction rule out the expression itself being a plot?
Yeah, okay. Look, the closest you can get to it is to say that if that contradiction is true, everything follows. So if you accept that, okay, so suppose the contradiction in question is P and not P, and you endorse if P and not P, then everything is true. Then your beliefs are going to entail triviality, what logicians call triviality. And look, there are some people who've argued for triviality. Everything is true, but it's pretty crazy. The view that I'm Jesus Christ is a certifiable ground for having me locked up for insanity. So as long as you don't believe that everything is true, that's saying that if it's true, then if this contradiction is true, everything is true, is as pretty good as you can get.
Mm-hmm. But I suppose the question was maybe I misunderstood the question. I'm not sure I did understand the question,
Oh,
but wasn't it something about the principle of non-contradiction itself being both true and false? Like if the LNC was a glut.
oh, okay. Maybe I misunderstood the question, but I thought it was: can you phrase the principle of non-contradiction in such a way that contradiction, a contradiction, or maybe every contradiction is ruled out? That's what I was answering. So what rules
Right.
out a particular contradiction is P and not P. It's if P and not P, then, well, logicians call it bottom. It's something that implies
Yeah.
everything, right? And if you want to do that for every contradiction, then you can have for all P, if P and not P, then bottom.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, there's an interesting point here, because you can't rule out a contradiction by saying it's not the case that P and not P for every P, because it's quite compatible with that for some P and not P. And some people may be surprised to know that it's not the case that P and not P is actually logical truth in many paraconsistent logics, and so are some contradictions. Really, the thing that's most operative in ruling out contradiction is explosion, which says if you accept a contradiction, then you're committed to everything, and that's probably about as irrational as you can get.
And that's that's the defining feature of a paraconsistent logic, but that's what allows you to have contradictions in your model that don't then pollute everything and reduce the whole thing to trivialism, isn't it?
Correct. It's the defining characteristic of a paraconsistent logic that explosion is not a valid principle of inference.
Okay, great. We've got a couple more, so I'm gonna throw this one up as well. I'm just going to think of intentional logics. Are they underdeveloped in analytic philosophy? Christoph Schuringer claims that it's a blind spot that's caused all the sort of modal metaphysics disputes. And I know Nathan, who's asking this question, has certain views. I think it's fair to say somewhat hostile towards intentional logics. But what's your view about this?
Can I ask a question back before I address that? I mean, what's being called an intentional logic?
Right. Well, I assume that Nathan's asking it in an informed way because I know him and he is generally informed. So I'm going to take it that he means like logic where it's not truth functional only, right? That it has operators where their behavior can't just be mapped out in terms of changes they make to truth functions of the formulas that they appear in. Isn't that the standard definition or something like that? Or maybe I've got the wrong end of the stick with that.
Look, the standard definition of an intentional logic, to the extent there is one, is a logic where material equivalents aren't substitutable for each other salva veritate. But I mean, modal logics are intentional by that criterion, and modal logics are some of the most intensely investigated logics since Saul Kripke's work in the sort of late 1960s. So I wasn't I was thinking that that can't be the meaning.
He's saying systems that include things like epistemic
Oh,
notions, for example.
okay.
I guess like epistemic modal logic.
Okay. Look, okay. So there are epistemic doxastic logics, which are well known. Usually they're taken to be kinds of modal logics. They use the same semantic techniques as modal logics. But there are problems if you do that, because well, you get a phenomenon called logical omniscience. So that roughly speaking, any logical truth is going to be known or believed or the subject of the appropriate intentional state. Obviously, that's not true. People don't believe every logical truth. They don't know every logical truth. So sometimes there's a sort of fallback which says, yeah, but we're only dealing with rational agents. Of course, that means that you're only dealing with, a best God and probably nobody else. So, if you want to get rid of this feature, what you need is a modal semantics, which uses not only possible worlds, but impossible worlds. And logics which deploy the technology of impossible worlds are not as old as semantics which just use possible worlds, but at least for the last 25, 30 years, they've been under increasing investigation and development. And now they're a very well recognized part of the logical menagerie. They're still not as well known as possible world semantics, but they're pretty well understood.
So by impossible worlds, what we mean is inconsistent worlds, more or less.
No, look, okay. The notion of impossible world is contentious. That's one definition, but I think it's probably not a very good one, because if you're a dialethist like me, contradictory worlds can be quite possible.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. Yeah, I was going to
Yeah.
say, surely that's not what we mean.
Look, there's a lot of debate on this, as you might imagine, but let me just try to put this simply. What's a physically impossible world? I mean, a physically impossible world is one, for example, where I jump up and hover 6 feet above the ground and don't fall down, right? What makes that a physically impossible world was because it couldn't happen if the world, it could only happen in a world where the laws of physics are different. All right, what's a logically impossible world? Well, it's a world where something happens which could only happen if the laws of logic were different. Of course, we might argue about what those logic laws are, but you can actually agree on this definition, whatever you take the correct laws of logic to be. So what you think is impossible is going to depend on your logic. And that seems reasonable enough. But I think that's a reasonable definition of a logically impossible world.
But that's so. When you were talking a moment ago about including impossible worlds
Mm.
in intentional theories like epistemic modal logics, what's the notion of impossibility here? Is it
Logical.
logical? So it's where there are different laws of logic. So something like
Well, if you look at the set of things that people believe, maybe even know, but that's not quite so obvious. Let's just think about belief. It's simpler. If you look at the things that people believe, these are not logically closed. I mean, you don't believe the logical consequence of all your beliefs. No one does, because we're finite state systems. So the set of beliefs is not closed under logic of any kind, whatever you think the correct logic is. So the world that is described by the things you believe and only the things you believe is not a logically possible world, whatever you think logic is.
right. But is that because it's gappy then? Because there are things that do follow from my beliefs that I don't include in my web of beliefs. But if I was making a kind of Kripkean possible world, I would fill through. I would basically close it by just started like deciding the truth value of everything.
Yeah, well, look, it's certainly incomplete because no one really believes the logical consequences of everything they believe.
Mm.
A glutty world would normally be used to describe a world where there are truth value gaps, things which are neither true nor false, which is a bit different because, say, an intuitionist's world can be complete in the sense that the logical consequences of everything you have is there in intuitionist logic, but it's still a gappy world in the sense that some things are neither true nor false.
Okay, well, I think it's probably I've kept you for quite some time. We're almost coming up onto 2 hours now. Um, I imagine, like myself, you're getting hungry. It's around dinner time there. My
It's
dog
moving
is
up to dinner time.
my
Well, we
dog's
could.
also getting hungry. She's sniffing
Okay.
around, doing that passive aggressive thing where she's trying to remind me that it's now dinner time and I should be doing something.
Okay.
So,
Look, I'm happy to answer a few more questions if you want to carry on for a bit longer. I don't mind.
I was just going to see if there were any sort of useful questions. That's all. I can show you some. Graham's paper on impossible world semantics is awesome. So you've got
Thank you very much.
Fran in. There was Nathan was okay. Yeah, I followed up a little bit more. I don't know if you've heard of Schuringer. I haven't though. I'm probably not even saying it properly.
Okay, I'm embarrassed to say I don't know his work.
No, well, Nathan's quite well read, so I wouldn't worry about that. He often reads things that I've not heard about, and
Okay. Well, I'm not competent to judge that. It may be
here's
true.
someone I'm sure you will have heard about. Though apparently, he argues this guy called Hugh McColl, who I'm sure you'll know from the 80s, from the 1800s, had an intentional
Ah,
system that's superior to crypt keys. Apparently,
yeah. Look, no, I mean he did have an interesting logical system. That's quite. It was very much towards the end of the 18th century, and I'm confess that I don't know the details. It's not very well studied. Maybe one might think it's superior to Kripke's work. I mean, I'd be very surprised if that were the case, but without having a very careful look at it, I'm not really in a position to judge.
there are many systems available, and crypt keys is only the one that sort of rose to prominence. It seems to me. I remember when I was doing my PhD, I met Noel Belknap a couple of times, and I
Mm.
remember the last time I was at a conference where he was at, he told me about this project he'd taken on, which was that somebody, I think a physicist, had worked out their own theory of intentional logic, and but not being a logician or in the logic community at all, had done it all their own way, and so it was very obscure and difficult to pass. He'd
Mm.
handed it into the philosophy department, hoping someone would clean it up, and somebody gave it to Belknap, and it sat on his desk for ages. And then after a while, he actually went back to it and went through it and formalized it. And him and another researcher he was working with were trying to convince me that it was really, really good for a load of reasons that went way over my head. So I'm sure that maybe maybe McColl's system is superior to Kripke's. Maybe this one that Belknap was going through is also superior to Kripke's. It's certainly possible, I guess. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly what Newell was talking about, but the history of relevant logic is kind of interesting because so relevant logic is basically a theory of conditionals, and it was invented by Anderson and Belknap in axiomatic form, and for a long time it didn't have a semantics, like modal logic, in fact. So the search for modal logic, for relevant logic semantics was on. And the first person who really had an idea of how to do it was an Australian, actually New Zealand logician called Richard Routley. He changed his name later to Richard Silver. So Richard had this draft of an article on the semantics of relevant logics, which he sent to the Pittsburgh logicians, including Newell. And it was difficult, and because it was a sort of first cut, it was hard to understand. So at that time, Bob Meyer was a student at Pittsburgh, student of Newell's. Bob was a very good mathematician, And so Bob took Richard's letter and worked on it and cleaned it up. And the semantics that came out of that is known as Routley-Meyer semantics. And it is nowadays pretty much the standard semantics for relevant logics. So I don't know if that's what Newell was talking about. Could have been. Maybe it was something different. I don't know.
I think it was something different. I think he called it case intentional first order semantics or something.
Oh, okay. Then that certainly is different.
Afterwards. Yeah. All right. Last little bit then. We do have a couple more questions. I don't know about this one either. Any thoughts on Terence Horgan's transvaluationism on vagueness? I don't know Terence Horgan either. If you don't, then there's no point speculating about it.
No, I don't know exactly what is called transvaluationism. Look, vagueness is a real problem. I actually think that vagueness is much harder than self-reference. Everything seems to be wrong. It really does. Even going, dialethic doesn't really help you, and that's a mark of how hard it is. Now, there are several different approaches to what's going on in a logic of vagueness. There's one relatively popular one called supervaluationism. I don't know if that's transvaluationism is another name for that. Without knowing exactly what transvaluationism is, I can't really say anything more than that that's intelligent.
Okay, and if somebody wants to amplify that, they can. One more from Nathan. Are there any important implications that representational/cognitive commitments have, which Graham's views as important for untangling the problems you've been dealing with? I'm not sure that counts as a sentence, strictly speaking, but we can get. So I think by representational semantics, I take it that that you have in mind something like the critiques, Wittgenstein's critiques in its later stage, critiquing a kind of picture-based view of how language works, I think. And is that something that you've thought about much? I mean, you mentioned Wittgenstein's analogy of the paucity of diet of examples earlier, so I guess maybe it's something along those lines.
Yeah, look, I'm a bit puzzled by commitments. I mean, views I'd have thought would be more appropriate. But representational cognitive views or commitments, if people are committed to them, could mean so many different things.
Nathan can join us on stream if he wants to ask his question directly. I can send you the invite and we can see how that goes. I'm not going to expose you to crazy people. You can trust me on that. Just give me 1 second. I'll send him a message and see if he wants to come on because he's being active. So just give me 1 second. I bought this laptop that I'm using right now about 6 months ago. And I thought, it's about time I had a new laptop. I've been using the same old laptop for like 10 years or best part of that. I mean, new one's going to be better, isn't it? No, I obviously didn't spend enough money, and I've got a laptop where I actually just hate the laptop and everything that it does all the time really annoys me. And it won't load the page that I'm trying to get to for some reason. God damn it. Just basically, I got a MacBook and it lasted me 10 years and never failed me at all. And
We've gone back to a PC.
so I'll see if I can. I can't. We have further clarification from Sully. Transvaluationism is the view that vagueness results in incoherence, but it's indispensable to our talk and thought. And that in the forced march Sorites, Horgan said we should refrain from.
Okay. Yes, so it's a sort of Fregean view. Well, it's true that if we... Okay, so... Sorites problems are caused by vagueness. Vagueness is essential to our language because there's absolutely no way we could be precise about nearly everything. So vagueness and so paradox really, I mean, it seems right that it's indispensable to our thought and talk. Is it incoherent? Well, okay, it depends what you mean by incoherence, but think of it like this. Let's agree that it's endemic to our thought. Let's suppose that it's incoherent, and coherence in the sense that if you just sort of keep doing Sorites arguments or applying modus ponens, you're going to get into crazy land. Let's suppose that all those things are right. We don't pursue the things which you might seem to think are good into incoherence, right? Oh, I think someone's just joined. I can see their forehead.
This is Nathan who's joined us now, yeah.
Oh, all right. So the question is, what in practice do we do to stop us getting into the incoherent land? It would seem to be systematic in some sense. What is the system? Is that underlying a logic? I mean, those are the sorts of questions I'd want to ask.
I think we still need to know more about the view in question to be able to say much about that. But fortunately, Nathan, I'm quite happy for you to talk to Graham and state your question and pick his brains whilst I go and feed my dog. So I'm going to hand over the stream. I'll be right back in like 2 seconds.
Yeah, sorry. I think when I clicked the link, it just brought me into the room. It doesn't put you in the background or anything to kind of come up. But yeah, the question about sort of like what you think the implications of representational / cognitivist views might be for these sorts of problems in logic. I mean, even part of why I'm bandying representational views with cognitivist views is because I think that often it's very sort of underspecified what people are talking about by these things. I think broadly what I'm thinking about is some kind of semantic thesis about like the meanings of words, or maybe it's going to be about propositions as a whole. So it might be that it might be something to do with like compositionality, the idea that if you break down sentences, there are meanings of concepts or noun phrases or verbs, and they sort of represent the things that they're about or something like that. So it brings up this problem of intentionality. If it is about whole sort of alethic sentences, then it might bring up sort of like problems of correspondence. But I think common to sort of all of these things is this idea of kind of language in some way picturing the world. And I guess that I think that that has some relevance to a lot of kind of like metaphysical questions in philosophy of mind. But I guess if you're thinking, sort of caveating the questions you're thinking about to these questions of logic, I wondered if any of those considerations have featured in your thought.
So the view that rejects representationalism, are we talking about Rorty or Brandom or
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of those sorts of things around. In terms of where I've been on this myself, I don't think there's a lot of sort of different views that are still figuring themselves out, I would say, in different disciplines. So you know, some of them are more kind of Wittgensteinian. Some of them are like very behaviorist, you know, like people kind of going back to before the cognitive revolution in psychology and trying to explain what's going on in terms of almost behavior of the organism. Some of these are people in like embodied or an activist psychology, sort of, or even considering themselves like pragmatists. And I think in my view, it kind of there's a lot of people who are exploring these different things, but there's no real kind of movement that it all fits under, if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay. Look, I find that hard question to answer without knowing a lot more about the details. But my immediate reaction is I don't really see whether these views are right or wrong. I don't see, oh, look, even if they're right, I don't really see that they would get you out of some of the tangles that we've been talking about. Just because a lot of these sort of paradoxical arguments, just take the liar, for example, don't seem to invoke these sort of representational views at all. At least I don't see how any of the things which generate the paradox are representational in any way.
Maybe I can try to the one that came to my mind when you were talking was this talk of like coherence, for example. And I was thinking, like, what are my intuitions about coherence? And I guess I don't really know. I guess I sort of have maybe spatial impressions that come to my mind, and maybe some intuitions about, like, you know, nodes that are connected to each other in a graph, and they can't be a certain way. Like they can't have like contradictory qualities or properties in my intuition. And so that leads me to say certain things with respect to coherentism about the way that a logical language should work based off of what's kind of coming before my mind when I think about that. And now, if those things are supposed to be um, representations, then maybe there's some theory that connects what those seemings are or whatever to something metaphysically informative. But if my considerations about language are thinking about it more as a behavior, then almost my kind of whatever I'm doing when I produce this behavior, I say intuitions or whatever experiences I have, it might be much less informative as to what is going on when I talk about something like coherence. Instead, the relevant thing to pay attention to might be the almost empirically looking at how are people using this language, or how are they taught it, what are humans trying to achieve socially when they deploy this language. And it kind of shifts the emphasis maybe away to a different way of looking at it. But that was why it came to my mind. I was wondering if you could have thought about stuff from that kind of angle.
Yeah. Well, again, I'm not sure how this might work, but look, I mean, if you give up the notion of truth, you avoid some of these problems. You bind a lot of others, of course. If you give up the notion of rationality, you avoid some of these problems, but you bind to lots of others. But as long as you are operating with some notion of truth and some notion of rationality, and I guess the guys you're talking about do, I don't really see how you're going to avoid a lot of these problems, because a lot of the problems don't depend greatly on the fine details of a theory of truth or rationality. The broad brushstrokes, which many people of many different persuasions can agree on, are going to sort of lead you into the kind of knotty areas that we've been talking about. So, I mean, as I say, my initial impression is it's not going to help. But, I'm old enough not to have learned not to be dogmatic. Okay. So, I mean, if someone can articulate these views in such a way that it addresses some of these problems in an interesting way, that's interesting. I'd like to know about it.
Well, maybe if I can try and can't talk for Nathan, but one way of putting a point that's similar, I think, is to reach for another Wittgensteinian metaphor. It's to be held captive by a picture, right? Where maybe there is a tendency for people to think that contradictions are less, or that they're completely impossible, because what they're doing is they're thinking they've got a sort of picture of what's going on, which is leading them astray. Like, I can think of an apple, I can think of it being blue, even, that's fine, or I can think of it being see-through or whatever. But if I try and think of it being an apple and a not apple, now I'm struggling to form a picture in my mind. And I think somehow, because of that impossibility, or my lack of ability, let's say, to do that, that picture forming mechanism breaks down there. I then start to think, well, that's actually a hard edge of reality itself, or something, rather
Okay.
than my own. Is there something
And
close to what you were saying, that Nathan, or have I completely missed
No,
it?
that's definitely a big aspect of it. Yeah.
yeah, so by picture you mean something sort of pseudo-visual.
Yeah.
Okay.
Potentially, yeah.
Lots of things are unvisualizable. So if we're dealing with, you know, the infinite, or with paradoxes of various kinds, you're dealing with things which can't be visualized in any sense. Now, there's also a question of how you know what it is you're visualizing. Okay, let me give you an example. What is it to be in motion? Okay, so Russell said to be in motion is to be here at one instant of time and here at another instant of time. Okay, somewhat before Russell, Hegel rejected this picture, and he said to be in motion is not to be here at one instant of time and here at another instant of time, but to be here and not here at one and the same instant of time. Well, it's a contentious view, but I suppose it's true. Then you see a contradiction all the time. It's, what is it like to visualize a contradictory state? Well, it's a state of any instant of something in motion. You can see that. Okay, you didn't realize that that's what you were seeing, and we often don't realize what it is we're seeing.
No, I think that the thought, sort of in the vein of where I may be coming from with the question, is that it would put an emphasis in terms of answering some of these like questions that are coming up on really like what our aims are as people who are raising the questions. And you know, it might just be a case of, well, the answer to the question that settles it sort of depends on whether or not there's something we care about doing that we can then do by accepting one of these answers, or something like that, you know.
Yeah, fair enough. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be sort of facetious, but what you've just said reminds me of the joke about the person that goes to the doctor and said, "Doctor, it hurts when I do this," and the doctor says, "Well, don't do that."
Yeah, no, I agree. I get what you're saying. Yeah, and I think it is a little bit like that. And then my view kind of becomes that what that does is it sort of then takes you away from those types of questions into maybe more like first order questions about, like, for example, if you've got a question about a contradiction, it's like, well, you know, it's going to be a particular example of a contradiction in, I don't know, some
Yeah,
theory of a science or something, and it's like, well, what do we want to do with this now, kind of thing, rather than like a theory in general contradiction.
yeah. Well, those are fair questions, but they're integral to the sorts of discussions we've been having. And it seems to me that you're certainly going to hit those in mathematics, in science, natural and physical. In fact, in any way of trying to understand what the world is, and I don't just mean the sort of mind-independent world, I mean your Lebenswelt. You know, you're going to have to engage with how things are in some very general sense. And I think that's going to generate many of the kinds of problems we've been talking about. But, you know, let's try and work out the details and see what happens.
Well, I appreciate you answering the question. Thanks for letting me up. I don't want to take away for, you know, I don't want to like distract the conversation. So thanks, Alex.
Yeah, you're welcome, Nathan.
Appreciate it. Cheers.
It's good feedback. And you like teaching us. Yes.
I'm muted. Let's start that again. What I was trying to say was I think I should draw it to a close because we have to at some point, and we can always do this again and continue to talk about these. Certainly, if you're up for that, Graham. I mean,
Sure.
That's good with me. So let's have a chat offline about some possible follow-up conversation. We'll put something in the diary and we can continue this. But just to say, again, as natural to do with these things, chuck a like and a subscribe on the video if you like this sort of content. If you think these types of topics are interesting and talking to Graham's a good thing to do, then let me know by supporting the channel in any way you can. And yeah, we'll do another one of these at some point down the line. So I'm going to stop the stream, but if you just stay on the line, Graham, because we just have to make the video upload. But yeah, thanks very much, everyone, and we'll see you in the next one.